Hello, everybody, and welcome back. In this segment, we're going to discuss how to utilize the competitive market model as a predictive framework for trying to forecast various market phenomena. We're going to start off today by just quickly reviewing factors that contribute to consumer demand. We'll specifically talk about demand curve shifters. Then we're going to jump to the other side of the economy, have a similar discussion, but in the context of supply curve shifters. We'll then discuss the difference between a movement along a curve versus a shift in the curve. There's a little bit of semantic complications caused by how economists describe these two things, so I want to be clear about that. And we will conclude by summarizing the three-step approach in the context of a few examples that allow us to utilize the competitive market framework to make predictions regarding prices, the volume of trade, and surplus. So, first topic here, demand curve shifters. Probably we'll be able to relate every one of the shifters more or less back to this first factor, which has to do with the number of buyers. But anytime you think about the number of buyers increasing, this is going to result in an increased quantity demanded at any given price. And the way we model this is with a rightward shift in the demand curve. Also note that rightward shifts geometrically also look like upward shifts. And in many cases, it's okay to think of the curve shifting upward instead of shifting right. But specifically today, we're going to model this as a rightward shift in the demand curve. So here's the example. We have an increase in the number of buyers. When the number of buyers increases, then at any price, we would expect the quantity to increase. In this example, the quantity seems to increase by 5 units, indicative of a parallel demand curve shift. However, demand curves do not have to shift in a parallel fashion, but for most of our diagrammatic purposes, we will represent these curves shifting in parallel fashion. The next important shifter that we will discuss is related to really not the number of buyers, but I want you to think of the size or power of the buyers, and that is income. Now, income is a little interesting in that there is not a completely unambiguous effect in terms of how income would affect consumer demand. So we're going to classify goods into one of two categories. Okay, we'll start off by defining here a normal good as a good whose demand is positively correlated or positively associated with income, implying that an increase in income causes an increase in the quantity demanded at each price. Another way to think about this is if consumers have normal goods, okay, meaning that they exhibit positive relationships with their income. If income goes up, then you can think about this as really you have a stronger consumer. Okay, so instead of more buyers, which shifts the demand curve right, now we have stronger buyers, which looks like we have more buyers, and that does the same thing. Okay, conversely, there are a class of goods known as inferior goods, and an inferior good has a demand that is negatively related to income. Okay, goods that could fall into this category, typical example that I like to think about is top ramen. Okay, when you're in college, you buy a lot of top ramen, or at least I did. Not the best food for you, but the point is the following. Okay, I chose to buy more top ramen because I was relatively poor. I had lower income. And anytime you decide to buy more of a good as your income declines, things like top ramen or maybe generic toilet paper, these would be considered inferior goods with respect to that individual's preference. So goods aren't normal or inferior across the board. This definitely depends on some assumption about the individuals that we are referring to in a market. So a good that's inferior to you maybe isn't inferior to me and vice versa. Okay, so just to summarize, normal goods are demand increases. When income goes up, they decrease when income goes down. So for normal goods, demand moves in the same way as income. Demand shifts in the same direction as the income change. But for an inferior good, the demand shift is in the opposite direction. When an inferior good, if we have an increase in income for an inferior good, demand curve is going to shift to the right, to the left. When we have a decrease in income for an inferior good, like if I get poorer, then I'm going to buy more top ramen. I'm going to see a rightward shift in the demand curve for that inferior good. So with inferior goods, again, we have an inverse relationship between income and demand. Okay, the other important shifter of a demand curve, okay, are prices of related goods. All right, so we're going to define goods as being related really in one of three ways, two major ways. First and foremost, we will define goods as being substitutable if an increase in the price of one good causes an increase in demand for the other. Okay? When the price of a substitute good goes up, okay, the demand curve for the other good will shift to the right. Okay, the example we're going to talk about here, if you think about pizza and hamburgers, these are not perfectly substitutable, but both alternatives for you to consume for lunch, for example. If we have an increase in the price of pizza, then the way we can think about this is that the law of demand tells us in the pizza market, fewer consumers are going to buy pizza. Okay, so some of those consumers are going to switch and show up as buyers now in the hamburger market, meaning effectively the number of buyers in the hamburger market has gone up, and this again shifts the demand curve to the right. So if we have an increase in the price of pizza, demand for hamburger shifts to the right. If the price of pizza had dropped, then the pizza market steals some consumers from the hamburger market, causing the demand for hamburgers to shift instead to the left. Other classic examples of substitutable goods, we got Coke and Pepsi, laptop and desktop computers. We'll see an example later where we talk about Google Play accounts and iTunes Store downloads, both ways of acquiring music. Okay, the other class of goods that we're going to discuss are goods that are known as complements, or goods that are complementary to one another. And we're going to define goods as complementary if an increase in the price of one of these goods causes a fall in the demand for the other. Okay, or conversely, if a decrease in the price of one good causes an increase in demand for the other. So the key here with complementary goods, okay, is that when the price of one good changes, the demand for the other is inversely related. It moves in the opposite direction. With substitutes, on the other hand, when one good's price increased, that increased the demand for the other good. Okay, so with substitutes, we had a positive or direct relationship between the price of one good and the quantity demanded with the other. And with complements, we have an inverse relationship between the price of related goods and the demand of the good of interest. Okay, so some examples of complementary goods, you could think of maybe computers and software. It's a pretty classic example. As the price of computers rise, people buy fewer computers, and as a result, demand fewer software packages. Okay, other classic examples, you got college tuition and books, bagels, cream cheese, eggs and bacon, hot dogs and hot dog buns are a pretty classic example. Something interesting to think about is why they sell hot dogs in a different numerical increment in which they sell hot dog buns. Something we're not going to get into in this course, but something kind of weird to think about. 8 hot dogs in a pack, but usually 10 to 12 buns in a pack. Moving along, other key demand curve shifter. Right, we had number of buyers. We had income, which is really the strength of the buyers. It looks like there's more buyers or fewer buyers because their income has changed. We have price of related goods, which again is really affecting the number of buyers being pushed to one market or the other due to either substitutable or complementary effects. Next important shifter we're going to discuss is tastes and preferences. So anything that causes preferences towards a good to increase, we're going to model that again as shifting the demand curve to the right. For example, in the 90s, the Atkins diet was extremely popular. A lot of protein, and this caused an increase in demand for eggs. So this caused a shift in the egg demand curve, moving in the rightward direction. Okay. Another example, information comes out. Surgeon's General warning tells us that smoking cigarettes is bad for our health. Okay, once that information came out, it changed a lot of people's preferences away from cigarettes, and we would model that as a leftward shift in the demand curve for cigarettes. Okay, last demand shifter that we are going to discuss before we move on to the supply side is expectations. And the interesting thing about expectations is that expectations are completely psychological. They're extremely belief-driven. But nevertheless, expectations about the future absolutely can affect a consumer's buying decisions in the present. For example, if you expect your income to rise in the future, this might cause you to, let's say, go out for a nice fancy meal today. Okay, you have this future expectation of making money, and you're willing to expend some of that income despite the fact you haven't yet earned it. Okay, another example, if the economy is doing poorly, people worry about their future job security, then typically we see a reduction in demand for things like automobiles. I'm worried about job security. I'm not going to go ahead and make that big purchase. Other changes to think about, okay, right, in terms of expectations, I could maybe expect prices to increase in the future. Okay, if I think prices are going to be more expensive in the future, then that could potentially cause me to want to buy more today. Okay, so it could be that I'm thinking about increased prices in the future, or perhaps decreased prices in the future. If I know prices are going to be cheaper later on, then I maybe want to hold off on my consumption until prices decrease later, and that would show up as a reduction in my demand, a leftward shift in my demand for the product today. Okay, so just to summarize, okay, variables that are influencing buyers, variables that are determining demand. First and foremost, the price of the good itself. Okay, anytime that changes, this is exactly what the demand curve captures, is the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded of the good. So when the price changes, we don't actually shift the curve. This is the only case where we are going to move along the curve. If the price goes up, we move leftward along the demand curve. If the price goes down, we move rightward. Okay, any factor that is not the price that affects demand, when these non-price factors change, then the demand curve actually shifts. For example, the number of buyers, this shifts the demand curve. When there are more buyers, demand shifts right. Fewer buyers, demand shifts left. Okay, when income changes, this also shifted the demand curve depending on whether or not the goods were normal or inferior. We're called normal goods. The demand was positively related to the income change. Inferior goods, the demand shift was negatively related to the income change. Okay, we had prices of related goods changing. Okay, whether or not they were substitutes or complements kind of depended, was kind of important in facilitating the directional change of the demand curve. For example, when the goods were substitutes, okay, we had a positive relationship between the demand curve shifting and the price of the substitute good changing. When the goods were complements, we had an inverse relationship between the demand curve shift and the price of the complementary good that changing that caused the demand curve shift. Okay, last two that were more psychological. We had changes in taste and preferences. Okay, anything that causes an increase in preference towards the good shifts the demand curve to the right. Anything that sours preferences away from the good shifts the demand curve to the left. And future expectations. Okay, my belief about maybe future prices or income or other external factors of the environment could potentially affect my demand today. All right, moving right along. Supply curve shifters. Okay, again, the supply curve shows us how price affects quantity, holding other factors equal. And again, these other factors, just like we had mentioned for the demand curve, are these non-price determinants of the supply. And anytime these non-price determinants of the supply, we mean things that are not the price of the good itself changing, these will cause the supply curve to actually shift. Okay, in general, I'm going to argue that the supply curve, which we saw reflects the marginal cost of production, is very closely related to the cost of production changing. Okay, anything that makes things more costly to produce will result in us being able to afford to produce less, a leftward shift in the supply curve. And anything that reduces the cost of production, okay, technological improvements, for example, those will allow us to afford to produce more at any price level, causing a rightward shift in supply curve. So the very first shifter here, again related to cost, are input prices. The input prices, these were literally the cost of our factors of production. Okay, anytime we have a reduction in input prices, okay, this means that at the same level of output, we're able to make even more profit because our costs are now lower. So the firm is able to produce a larger quantity at any given price. Again, we're going to model this as a rightward shift in the supply curve. Okay, so in this case, suppose the price of milk falls. At each price, the quantity of lattes of coffee supplied is going to increase by 5. Again, in this example, we have a rightward parallel shift of that supply curve, but the shift could be non-parallel. Okay, it can absolutely happen, but for our purposes, a parallel shift is okay. The other important shifter here, again related to the cost of production, is technology. Okay, technology determines the rate at which we are able to convert inputs into outputs. And anytime we have some sort of cost-saving technological improvement, this is going to have a very similar effect as a fall in input prices, which we modeled as something that makes production cheaper. And anytime this happens, we have a technological improvement that makes production cheaper, the supply curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, it is possible that we have a degradation of technology where technology gets worse. This doesn't happen as frequently. Maybe over a really long time periods, certain civilizations forget certain technological processes, like we forgot, for example, how we built the pyramids. It's possible that we have a reduction in technology, and this causes the supply curve to shift to the left. Next important shifter, very similar to the demand curve, also the number of sellers affects the market supply curve. Okay, so if you have an increase in the number of sellers, the quantity supplied at each price is also going to increase. Okay, so just like the number of buyers was positively related to the direction of the demand curve increase, same thing is true for the sellers. Last but not least, we have expectations. Okay, again, if sellers, for example, expect prices to go up, for example, maybe an event or some tumultuous event in the Middle East leads to expectations of higher oil prices. In response, sellers of oil now have an incentive to hold off and wait for those higher prices. Okay, because we're waiting for the higher prices in the future, we reduce our supply today, meaning we would see a leftward shift in today's supply of oil. Okay, so again, in general, sellers may adjust supply when their expectations of future prices change, even if the price doesn't wind up changing in the future, meaning it's possible expectations are incorrect, but people respond to them anyway. Okay, so just to summarize the variables that we've discussed here in terms of determining the supply or influencing the supply curve, first we had the price of the good itself. Again, just like the demand curve, when we change the price along the vertical axis itself, we never shift the curve. We only move along the curve. And we're going to use some terminology to differentiate between these two cases momentarily. Any change in input prices. If I had an increase in input prices, this shifted the supply curve left because production became more expensive. If I had a reduction in input prices, this shifted the supply curve to the right or downward. Any changes in technology affected the supply curve very similarly. Anything that reduced the cost of production, it was cost saving. This shifted the supply curve to the right. Any change in technology that was increasing the cost of production then shifted the supply curve to the left. Okay, number of sellers, very similar intuition here relative to the buyer side of the market. Sellers increase in number, this shifts the supply curve to the right. If they decrease in number, it shifts the supply curve to the left. Okay, last but not least, there was some psychological component here from the seller's perspective, similar to the buyers as well, and that is that the sellers are also cognizant of expectations. Okay, so now that we've discussed variables that influence both the demand and the supply curves, we could think about an external factor changing, shifting one of these curves, and then potentially changing the market equilibrium from one price quantity allocation to another. And that is what we are going to discuss next when we're thinking about how to utilize this model to make predictions. Okay, so step one in making a prediction requires us to decide how a particular environmental change in the economic environment affects either the supply curve, the demand curve, or potentially both. So first thing we've got to do is figure out which curve is affected by the economic environmental change. And then the second thing we're going to do is figure out in which direction the curve or curves shift. Okay, so which curve is affected, which direction does it shift? Okay, once we've done that, we're going to use the supply and demand curve diagram to look at how we evolve from one equilibrium at the intersection of the original supply and demand curves to the new equilibrium at the intersection of the post-shifted supply and demand curves. Okay, so we're going to start off here. with an example in the market for hybrid vehicles. So I got the price of hybrid cars on the vertical axis, the quantity of hybrid cars traded on the horizontal axis. We have our downward sloping demand curve for hybrid vehicles and an upward sloping supply curve for hybrid vehicles. And we're going to start off by assuming that our initial equilibrium describes the initial market conditions. Okay, now we will consider the following change. And I'm giving you kind of a hint here that this is going to constitute a shift in demand case. But on an exam, I might not tell you this. I might just tell you, for example, that the event that we're analyzing here is there's an increase in the price of gas. Okay, now hopefully you're thinking that, well, if it's a hybrid vehicle, okay, the price of gas is somewhat of a substitute for my use of the hybrid vehicle. Okay, and hopefully you're thinking, well, at step one, that sounds like it affects the demand curve. Okay, price of gas absolutely affects the demand for hybrids. Okay, and the supply curve here, we're going to assume does not shift because the price of gas does not affect the cost of producing hybrids. Now, that's probably not a great assumption. It's really hard to produce anything without gas, but let's assume that's the case for now so we can focus just isolating the effects of this demand curve shift. Okay, so supply curve here is not shifting. Here we're going to get a shift in the demand curve. So step one, we've done well here. Now step two, in which direction does the demand curve shift? Well, let's think about this. If gas prices have increased, okay, now the substitutable mode of transportation is more expensive. If I have to use a gas guzzler, that's going to cost me more, meaning that pushes some buyers into this market for hybrid vehicles. So it's as if the number of buyers in the hybrid market increased. Okay, and that is absolutely consistent with a rightward shift in the demand curve for these hybrid vehicles. Okay, so two ways to think about this. Buyers increased in number because they got moved over from the gas vehicle market, or we had the increase in the price of a substitutable good. And we had a resulting increase in the demand, a rightward shift in the demand. Third step in the process here, after we have identified the demand curve shifting, is to identify the evolution of the equilibrium. So we started off at P1Q1. Note that the shift causes both an increase in the price of vehicles and the quantity traded. Okay. The other thing to note here is that when the price rises, okay, the sellers at the higher price are also selling more. So the quantity supplied is actually increased here, despite the fact that the supply curve itself didn't shift. Okay, so we're going to be kind of careful here, distinguishing between a shift in the curve versus a movement along the curve. Just some semantics to get around here. Okay, so anytime we have a change in something, a change in supply or change in demand, okay, then we're thinking about the curve actually shifting. And this always happens when something changes that affects supply or demand that is a non-price factor. Okay, a non-price determinant. Anytime we change something that's not the price of the good itself, the curve is going to shift. However, anytime we change the price of the good itself, okay, then we do not shift the supply curve, we just move along the supply curve, and we will refer to this not as a change in supply, but as a change in the quantity supplied. And again, this occurs specifically when we change the price of the good itself. Okay, now with respect to demand, same idea. If you hear the words change in demand, that means that the demand curve has actually shifted. This again happens when we're changing a non-price determinant of demand, something that's not the price of the good. However, if we change the price of the good itself, similarly to the supply case, we move along the demand curve, and we would refer to this as a change in the quantity demanded. Okay, so we'll see if we can kind of think about disentangling some of this context, some of these semantic complexities in the next example here, where we consider a shift in supply. Okay, now again, on a test, I might not tell you that it's going to be a supply shift. You would just have to know how this particular event affects either the supply, the demand curve, or both. And now the event of interest is we have a new technology that reduces the cost of producing a hybrid vehicle. Okay, so production costs, we know in step one, those showed up as a factor that affects the supply curve. Okay, so no shifts in the demand curve in this example because production technology was not a demand curve shifter. So step one, the supply curve is shifting. Now, in which direction is the supply curve shifting? Well, because the technology has reduced the cost, we can think about the supply curve shifting either downward. Okay, remember, the supply curve measures the marginal cost of production to the firm. So if the cost is lower now, it's a downward shift in the supply curve, or equivalently, we could think of this as a rightward shift. But notice just geometrically, if you shifted it down or shifted it right, the picture looks the same. Okay, now that we've completed steps 1 and 2, we can move to step 3 and see that the quantity of trade is increased, but the price in the new equilibrium has actually dropped. All right, now in this example, we have the following. We had a shift in demand, okay, meaning we had a change in demand. So the curve actually, or sorry, not a change in demand, I apologize. It's a change in supply. The supply curve actually shifted. And that shift caused a change in the quantity demanded. The shift in the supply curve changed the price, and the change in the price caused us to move along the demand curve from P1Q1 to P2Q2. Now, it's possible we have some factors that change simultaneously. Okay, for example, let's suppose we had both events in examples 1 and 2 happen together. Okay, then step 1, well, we know both curves are going to shift. And we know that both curves are going to shift to the right. Okay, now, problem is we do not have information at this point on the relative size of these shifts. So you'll notice as I've drawn the diagram, it looks like the demand shifted more than the supply. This is more of a demand-driven phenomenon. And because of that, when we get to step 3, we see that the price, it looks like, had gone up here. And for sure, the quantity's gone up. But it turns out that the price effect is actually a little bit ambiguous here. Okay, meaning if I had shifted the supply curve further to the right, if the supply curve moved way, way farther to the right, then it's possible that the supply increasing puts actually downward pressure on that price. Okay, so when both curves shift, I have to know a little bit more in terms of which curve shift farther in order to be able to predict the effect on the price in the market. If both curves shift to the right, then obviously the quantity has to increase, but the effect on the price could be ambiguous here. Okay. Supply shifts farther. Now you can see exactly what I'm referring to. That demand still increased. The quantity demanded went up, but now the supply curve shifting had dominated the demand curve shifting. Okay, so again, change in supply, we're talking about shifting the curve itself. Change in the quantity supplied, we're talking about moving along the curve. We only move along the curve when we change the price of the good itself. And same thing applies to the buyer side of the economy. Okay, change in demand, we changed some non-price determinant of demand, we actually shifted the curve. Change in the quantity demanded, we just moved along a fixed demand curve. Okay, just to wrap things up, I'd like to use our 3-step method here to think about analyzing the following effects in the markets for iTunes store downloads. Okay, the first event we're going to consider here is what happens if there is a fall in the price of a Google Play account. Okay, so hopefully you're thinking about how a Google Play account is related to iStore downloads. They are absolutely substitutable ways of listening to music. Okay, event B that we're going to think about involves the sellers of iTunes store downloads negotiating a reduction in the royalties they must pay for each song they sell. Okay, so hopefully you're thinking about how the royalties play in that scenario, and the royalties actually affect iTunes' ability to sell the goods, so it's a production cost here. And if the royalties gone down, then we could think about that as a reduction in an input price. Okay, that's making production cheaper. Then we'll consider what happens when both events occur together. Just like the last example we saw, there may be some ambiguities to be concerned with. Okay, so we're starting with our iTunes Store downloads market, and we're considering a fall in the price of Google Play. So first step, okay, which curve is shifting? Step one, well, because Google Play is a substitutable good, we know this is a factor that affects the demand curve. Okay, because Google Play accounts have become cheaper, okay, this is going to cause some iTunes Store individuals to leave that market to join the Google Play market, meaning the number of buyers in the iTunes Store download market effectively diminishes and shifts to the left. So we have a leftward change in demand. Okay, and note that both price and quantity fall. Okay, we had a change in demand that caused a reduction in the quantity supplied. We had a change in demand that caused a change in the quantity both demanded and supplied. Okay. Event B, next situation. If we have the fall in the cost of royalties paid to the musicians, okay, well, since the royalties we can think of as a production cost, okay, then this is going to affect the supply curve. And since the production costs are lower, we can think of this as, again, as shifting that supply curve either down or to the right. Okay, and using the three-step method, we can observe here that the market price actually falls as the equilibrium quantity rises. Okay, so we're just taking these steps again in this three-step approach. Okay, third situation we're going to look at is what happens if there's a fall in the price of both the Google Play account and a fall in the cost of royalties being paid to musicians. So step one, this causes both curves to shift, as we have already highlighted in parts A and B. Okay, the demand curve is shifting left, the supply curve is shifting right. When this happens, you should see that the price unambiguously is going to fall. Okay, P is absolutely going to go down. Less people want it, and more sellers are trying to sell it. This drives the price down. However, we do not have information on the size of the relative shifts of the supply and the demand curve. So in this case, the effect on the quantity is actually ambiguous. Okay, when we had both of the curves shifting in the same direction, we knew for sure what happened to the quantity, but the effects of price were ambiguous. Now when the curves shift in different directions, the effects on the price are unambiguous, but now what happens to the volume of trade really depends on having that additional information and knowing which curve shifted further. All right, hope you enjoyed, and we will be back shortly.